We are unfortunately at a time in history when technological advances hidden from the public can facilitate the satanic elite's envisioned panopticon reality, where everything, every movement, every thought, and every dream can be monitored and controlled to the benefit of the controlling psychopaths. A glimpse into this world exposes the extremes of torture being endured by innocent citizens today, and how these same torture devices will control your thoughts, your emotions, and your every movement in the very near future. There is a deep history of torture-based, government-sponsored mind control experimentation on children throughout the Western world, especially emanating from the U.S. and its infamous Project Paperclip. As described by the 1975 Church Committee report, quote, "These various CIA MKUltra programs resulted in substantial violations of the rights of individuals within the United States." End quote. This statement, bleached and politically impotent as it is the most damning utterance to come out of this committee. Its intention was to expose and stop these blatantly immoral and destructive programs being conducted on innocent civilians in the name of national security. Admittedly, however, this is understandable because the Church Committee's efforts were thwarted at every turn by the CIA, the deep state, and the executive branch of government, headed at that time by Gerald Ford, and personally stymied by his Deputy Chief of Staff, Dick Cheney. In addition, you should know that all documents regarding these programs had been previously ordered to be destroyed in 1973 by Richard Helms, the then CIA director, and Sid Gottlieb, head of the MKUltra programs. In January, as Helms was leaving the agency, he ordered all documents pertaining to the unconscionable mind control experiments, Artichoke, Monarch, Often, Operation Midnight Crisis, all collectively referred to as MKUltra, destroyed. The outgoing CIA director and his trusted protege and psychopath, Sid Gottlieb, hoped no doubt to wipe out all traces of the abominable experiments and all history of the thousands of human victims. But in retrospect, we can get some inkling of what was going on with the CIA mind control and torture programs through a 1977 FOIA request and various lawsuits filed to gain justice for the abused victims. The FOIA request sought information on the grant proposals and contracts awarded under the MKUltra program and the names of the institutions and individuals that performed the research. The extent of the program was astounding. It was found that grants and contracts were awarded to 149 subprojects, 80 institutions, and 185 private researchers. To give you an idea of what went on during these projects, your tax dollars at work, one lawsuit involved a medical doctor named Ewan Cameron and the Allen Memorial Institute. Without conceding liability in 1988, the CIA agreed to pay $750,000 to settle a case brought on behalf of 9 plaintiffs who were subjected to federally funded mind control experiments sponsored by the CIA and conducted by prominent psychiatrist Ewan Cameron, MD. The experiments included heavy doses of LSD, electroshock, and psychic driving. These experiments involved torture that had been called beyond Nuremberg by the American Bar Association. To the obviously frightfully twisted Ewan Cameron, a former prison psychologist, Canada's prisons seemed to be the ideal testing ground for LSD experiments administered to unwitting inmates. In this particular lawsuit, a total of 23 female inmates at the now defunct Federal Prison for Women in Kingston were administered LSD as part of a study. One such victim was 18 at the time of her victimization. She received at least one extremely powerful dose of LSD and was put in a 5-foot by 7.5-foot windowless cell lit only by a single light bulb, with only a mattress on the floor and a hole in which she could pass bodily waste. Such treatment allegedly caused not only brain damage to this individual, but subsequently this person experienced lasting, terrifying hallucinations. Another brainwashing victim of the CIA and Ewan Cameron was awarded $100,000 after receiving successive controversial electroshock treatments in a Montreal psychiatric institute. The shock treatment turned the victim, a then 19-year-old honor student, into a crazed woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed from a bottle, and urinated on the floor. All of these experiments supposedly were to create mind control slaves. One question I have: who authorized the government to produce mind control slaves? I didn't. Did you? Although the MKUltra program was supposedly ended in 1973, there's a mountain of evidence and victim testimonies that can prove beyond any doubt that this program, or similar, even more draconian, illegal interventions, are alive and well to this day. They simply went underground, where no oversight of any kind could save these poor victims.
In a description offered by Ellen P. Lachter, Ph.D., a psychologist with 17 years' experience working with mind control victims, she writes, quote, "Torture-based mind control programming can be defined as systematic torture that blocks the victim's capacity for conscious processing through pain, terror, drugs, illusion, sensory deprivation, sensory overstimulation, oxygen deprivation, cold, heat, spinning, brain stimulation, and often near death, and then employs suggestion and/or conditioning to implant thoughts, directives, and perceptions in the unconscious mind, often in newly formed trauma-induced dissociated identities, that force the victim to do, feel, think, or perceive things for the purposes of the programmer. The objective is for the victim to follow directives with no conscious awareness, including execution of acts in clear violation of the victim's volition, moral principles, and spiritual convictions." End quote.
This abuse usually starts in early childhood. Practitioners of this dark art include any psychopath wishing to use children in religious rituals, organized crimes such as child pornography, prostitution, and human trafficking, or groups with political, military, or espionage agendas.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme whose ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all through the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. I was exploited unwittingly for nearly 3 decades of my life, and the only explanations given to me were that, quote, the end justifies the means, and, quote, I was serving my country in their bold effort to fight communism. I can only summarize my circumstances by saying they took an already abused 7-year-old child and compounded my suffering beyond belief. The saddest part is, I know for a fact that I was not alone. There were countless other children in my same situation, and there was no one to help us until now. I've already submitted as much information as possible, including conversations overheard of the people, agencies responsible. I'm able to report all this to you in such detail because of my photographic memory and the arrogance of the doctors, the arrogance of the people involved. They were certain they would always control my mind. Although the process of recalling these atrocities is not an easy one, nor is it without some danger to myself and my family, I feel the risk is worth taking. Dr. L. Wilson Green, who claimed to have received $50 million from the Edgewood Chemical and Radiology Laboratory as part of the TSD, or Technical Science Division of the CIA, once described to Dr. Charles Brown that, quote, children were used as subjects because they were more fun to work with and cheaper, too. They needed lower profile subjects than soldiers or government people, so only young, willing females would do. Besides, he said, I like scaring them. They in the agency think I'm a god, creating subjects and experiments for whatever deviant purposes Sid and James can think up. Sid being Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, James, Dr. James Hamilton. In 1958, I was to be tested, they told me, by some important doctors from the society, or the Human Ecology Society, and I was instructed to cooperate. I was told not to look at anyone's faces and not to ignore any names, as this was a very secret project. But I was told to be brave, and all these things would help me forget. Naturally, as most children do, I did the opposite and remembered as much as I could. Dr. John Gittinger tested me, Dr. Cameron gave me the shocks, and Dr. Green the x-rays. Then I was told by Sid Gottlieb that, quote, I was ripe for the big A, or meaning artichoke. By the time I left to go home, just like every time from then on, I would remember only whatever explanations Dr. Robert G. Heath of Tulane Medical University gave me for the odd bruises, needle marks, burns on my head, fingers, and even the genital soreness. I had no reason to believe otherwise. They had already begun to control my mind. The next year, I was sent to a lodge in Maryland called Deep Creek Cabins to learn how to sexually please men. I was taught how to coerce them into talking about themselves, and it was Richard Helms, who was deputy director of the CIA, Dr. Gottlieb, Captain George White, Morris Allen, who all planned on filming as many high government agency officials and heads of academic institutions and foundations as possible, so that later when the funding for mind control and radiation started to dwindle, projects would continue. I was used to entrap many unwitting men, including themselves, all with the use of a hidden camera. I was only 9 years old when this sexual humiliation began. I overheard conversations about a part of the agency called ORD, which I found out was Office of Research and Development. It was run by Dr. Green, Dr. Stephen Aldrich, Martin Orne, and Morris Allen. Once a crude remark was made by Dr. Gottlieb about a certain possible leak over New Orleans East involving a large group of retarded children who are being given massive doses of radiation. He asked, why was Wilson so worried about a few retarded kids? After all, they would be the least likely to spill the beans. Another time, I heard Dr. Martin Orne, who was the director then of the scientific office and later the head of the Institute for Experimental Research, state that, quote, in order to keep more funding coming from different sources for radiation and mind control projects, he suggested stepping up the amounts of stressors used and also the blackmail portion of the experiments. He said it needed to be done faster than to get rid of the subjects, or they were asking for us to come back later and haunt them with our remembrances. It is because of the cumulative effects of exposure to radiation, chemicals, drugs, pain, and subsequent mental and physical distress that I've been robbed of the ability to work and even to bear any children of my own. It is blatantly obvious that none of this was needed, nor should it ever have been allowed to take place at all.
Psychopaths focus on their victims' capacity to form disassociated self-states in response to extreme pain and terror. These abusers use torture to coerce their victims' psyches into forming new disassociated self states that they can work to exploit. They use torture, hypnosis, and behavioral conditioning to create in their victims disassociated self states that will serve the functions defined by the psychopath along with his or her funding agency, usually one of the deep state controlled spy agencies or their many contractors. In these scenarios, the victim, usually a child, starting usually before the age of 6, is subject to extreme abuse. They can only find relief by creating alternative personalities to deal with each particular depraved experience to which he or she is exposed. In addition, the torturer can compel the victim to create alters for their specific purposes. For example, to create a super soldier, an alter where fear is never experienced. A sex slave might require sex kitten programming. An assassin might require psychopathic alters to heartlessly murder on behalf of their controlling handler. Most individual mind control victims have at least one alter custom-made for demonic possession. Victims are usually women in this program, but the program also contains men. One famous example of a victim is Kathy O'Brien.
When I was really little, as far back as I can remember, I was sexually abused. And the sexual abuse went into child pornography. But as a little child, it was so natural to me to be in a sexual mode all the time that reaching out when I saw someone aroused was just a normal thing for me to do. My sexuality was never suppressed. I was never told that's wrong. I was never, it was encouraged. So I just grew up thinking that was the norm.
With the abuse that I went through, it was as though my spirit was removed from it, like it took flight. It was a safe place. One that was actually in flow while my body was being directed by other people and ended up, being involved in things I had no way I ever would have participated in.
It was early evening when they played Most Dangerous Game.
I was stripped of my clothing. I was allowed to wear tennis shoes and told that I could have a head start and begin running before I would be hunted down. My exposure to it resulted in my believing I had no place to run and no place to hide. It seemed there were no limits to what could happen in my existence at that time.
It was one of the most extreme situations I think I ever survived.
When I was a really young child growing up in Muskegon, Michigan, this would be the early 60s. I was born in 1957. My father had been sexually abusing me as far back as I can remember. And he often bragged of substituting his penis for my mother's nipple while I was an infant. So my sexuality was heightened from a very, very early age. And I also developed what is known as dissociative identity disorder. It was formerly termed multiple personality disorder, but has since been redefined because it's not multiple personalities, but the shattering of a personality and a compartmentalization of memory, of trauma, too horrible to comprehend. Childhood sexual abuse is certainly too horrible to comprehend. There was no place for that in my mind. This compartmentalization of memory was what the government was interested in, because they figured that if a person couldn't think to bring to mind abuse, they wouldn't be able to think to bring to mind government secrets, government perversions, or anything else they wanted compartmentalized in the brain. My experience as a mind control slave on a White House Pentagon level was extreme. I was totally robotic. I had no capacity to think for myself. I didn't have any free thought whatsoever. I didn't even have the ability to question, to reason, or consciously comprehend what I was involved in.
A less well-known, but also an interesting case, is that of Sandy Bergen, who is also to this day a targeted individual.
Your name again, please?
I was born Sandy Bergen, November 15, 1959, in Mount Clemens, Michigan. And there was an Air Force base less than 5 miles away from that hospital. And I was taken back to the hospital when I was 3 years old. My mother put me in a I was not sick that morning. And she wrapped me in a blanket and rocked me in her arms and took me to the hospital, and they put me in a cage. And I always remembered it as what I thought was 3 to 4 days, but through the extensive therapy, I know it was much longer. And I never forgot a lot of parts of that hospital stay, and other ones started flashing back when I had what I call my awakening in December of 2012, when it was like a bag was taken off my head and I was being led to information and websites and books, and I started putting the pieces of the puzzle together of the horrible childhood that I had with all of the sexual abuse and the hospital stay, which I'd like to describe. The hospital stay, that would have been in about 1969. I was about 3 years old. I was put in a cage. There was never any vitals taken. Other children were in cages around me. And we were let out of the cages to go in the play corner to play with blocks and puzzles and numbers. And the only visit from my parents in those days that I was there was when they came and they brought me puzzles. And I sat in that cage and I solved them 1, 2, 3. And that's what the brain is prepared for the fragmentation through the puzzles and symbols, and they put the commands in. Right after the hospital stay, my cousin was spending the night. He's about my age or a year younger than me, actually, and I was very excited. My cousin was spending the night, and they put him in bed with me. And I remember the first time I woke up, and it was a rough hand fondling me, and I remember thinking it felt good and it felt familiar. And through now my extensive therapy, I've seen that they sexually abused me. It would wake me up in the cage just like that. And I remember my eyes popping open, and I was like, ooh, this feels good. And it did feel familiar, and it went on for years. By the time I was 6, 7 years old, I knew my cousin's penis. I mean, we were having all kinds of sexual night after night. My brother, 3 years older than me, molested me most of my childhood, and I had blocked that out. And then I started remembering, and I called my brother and I said, do you remember when you undressed me in Mom and Dad's bed? And he goes, oh no, that was in the tent. And then boom, I had probably 20 incidences that I started remembering that I had blocked out. And my brother always through my childhood would call me names and sing songs, fat songs about me. And I had no self-esteem time I was an adult. And I remember when I was in 2nd grade, so Anna, you asked me what 2nd grade would have been, 6, 7 years old, and I was down the street, and I was in bed naked with a boy 3 years older than me, and he was trying to put his penis in my butt, and his mom stormed open the door, and I remember being embarrassed and disappointed because that's what I thought I was. And I would be triggered to go through drawers as a child, and I went in my dad's drawer, and right on top was I was probably 7 years old, was a big, thick pornography book with graphic cartoons with, grandpa with granddaughter and sex with animals. And that was my go-to toy as a child. And I'm pretty sure that they suck off of your sexual energy. Sharon, I called her the Madame. I think she's Madame. She took us on a tour of the Ford factory, her and her sons, myself and her sons, and it was a private tour. And we went in a side door, and they had us stop and look this way and look that way. And from reading what Kathy O'Brien said, that the perpetrators of this like to see their victims out of the bedroom scene. And I realized that my first cousin, Rich, ended up working for Ford's. The cousin that I had all that sex with works for Ford's now, and the Fords are big in Michigan, and I'm pretty sure that they supported this program, this nefarious program.
You're talking about the Ford Motor Company?
Gerald Ford went right to Kathy O'Brien's house
when she was the president.
Yes, exactly. And
According to Schaefer, R.E., and Cozzolino, L.J., 1992, in a report entitled Adults Who Report Childhood Ritualistic Abuse, published in the Journal of Psychology and Theology. Here are some common types of abuse used in torture-based mind control programming.
As I said before, these programs went dark in 1974, which means that there currently is no accountability, oversight, or moral limitations on the atrocities committed by the psychopaths now in charge of the program, working for what we now know as the sociopathic deep state matrix. The Tavistock Institute, which can be regarded as the greatest brainwashing organization to ever exist in the course of human history, was dedicated to the study of trauma-based mind control, beginning by studying shell-shocked British soldiers in World War II. The firebombing of innocent civilians in Dresden was said to be one of its first endeavors, designed and executed exclusively to test the effects of the devastation on the civilian population. It was well known at that point that Germany had essentially lost the war and was not a danger to the world. In this particular atrocity, civilian encampments were hit, not military targets, killing over 125,000 people, which were mostly older men, women, and children. Which leads me to wonder about the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, since in the Pacific, the Allies had already defeated the Japanese before these devastating weapons were dropped. To this day, there are many speculations as to why these weapons were used on civilians, with obviously no military purpose. What the human species can stand in terms of torture, depravity, and trauma is of great interest to this day to the Tavistock Institute and the satanic psychopaths that rule the world. Tavistock, the nerve center for the global manipulation of human consciousness, represents the embryonic stage of all the subsequent satanic trauma-based programs. Beginning with experimenting with microwave weapons to control populations, through the MK Ultra mind control programs, through today's asymmetrical warfare victims being electronically tortured in their homes, to the psychological torture and control of all humanity through smart technology, nanoparticles, microwaves, HAARP pulses, cell towers, and other high-tech devices. Tavistock lurks in the background.
As alluded to earlier in this video, the torture prison at Guantanamo Bay was, and still is, obviously maintained for other reasons, other than the stated purpose of gleaning information from prisoners to help protect the fatherland. Or should I say, homeland. As you might remember, the individuals held in this blight on human dignity might not have even been terrorists, let alone anyone with critical information. They could more rightly be called the most unlucky of the unlucky. That characterization was confirmed in an email by Thomas Berg, staff judge advocate for the Joint Task Force. He stated that, quote, "I can understand why a lot of people were scraped up from the battlefield and brought to Gitmo because we didn't know what we had, but we didn't have any real mechanisms to sort them out. And I think once we started sorting them out, we'd already stated publicly that we had, quote, the worst of the worst, unquote. And it was a little hard to go against that and say, well, maybe some of them aren't quite the worst of the worst, and some of them are just the slowest guys off the battlefield, unquote.
Reading from a report entitled Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab, published by Seton Hall Law University, School of Law Center for Policy and Research, the real role of torture at Guantanamo is revealed. Quote, the stated intended purpose of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center was to house the most dangerous detainees captured in the course of the global war on terrorism. Founded in 2002, the commander in charge of detention operations, Brigadier General Rick Backus, effectively operated the camp as a facility for housing prisoners of war. As POWs, the detainees were entitled to basic human rights afforded under the Geneva Conventions. Pursuant to typical military command structure, Brigadier General Backus answered to the United States Southern Command, SOUTHCOM. Little did he know, however, the executive branch had created a second, secret chain of command, forging direct access between intelligence officers to the President of the United States. The intelligence commander and head of the second chain of command, Major General Michael E. Dunleavy, received his marching orders directly from President George W. Bush. These orders commanded Major General Dunleavy to debrief Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld once a week, in person, on matters of intelligence, which avoided placing any record of their discussions in written form. Major General Dunleavy's predecessor, Major General Miller, also reported daily to the Secretary of Defense, once per week by telephone. This arrangement operated beyond the scope of the established military chain of command. What was it that the executive branch was so eager to gain from intelligence at Gitmo? The continued pressure effectively created Gitmo's alter ego. Out of it emerged America's, quote, battle lab, end quote. Every lab must have its test subjects, and Gitmo was no different. Its rats were human beings, detainees. Instead of receiving POW treatment, the detainees underwent a level of interrogation overwhelmingly condemned by federal government agencies at the time and criticized by all the agencies involved in intelligence gathering. When the FBI expressed concern over the legality of some interrogation techniques, the agents were told by intelligence officials at Gitmo to act like, quote, guests that they were. Soon, all personnel not connected with intelligence gathering became guests at the base, unwelcome in many areas of the camp. Brigadier General Backus was muscled out of the facility when his complaints regarding detainee treatment began to interfere with the intelligence mission. Soon after this, all operations were consolidated into a joint task force under the direct supervision of Intelligence Commander Major General Miller. The criticized torture tactics, known as enhanced interrogation techniques, were not utilized for the purpose of obtaining reliable information. Instead, the quote results the executive branch was searching for was something much more sinister. The government sought information on the most effective ways to torture a human physically, information on the most damaging ways to break a man psychologically, and insight as to just how far the human body could be pushed in pain and terror before organ failure or death. Upon arrival, the detainees were routinely given psychosis-inducing drugs and were held in isolation for up to 30 days without access to human contact, including the International Committee of Red Cross. Once in Gitmo, non-compliant detainees could also be subject to isolation techniques, which triggered denial of access both to doctors and Red Cross representatives. When detainees underwent torture, medics monitored their vital signs to ensure that there was no organ failure or death. The policy implemented at the camp was that if a detainee's pulse dropped below 40 beats per minute, the interrogation had to stop until his pulse was raised to 41 beats per minute. Medics would also draw blood to determine how close each detainee was to kidney failure from the interrogations. In addition, the Department of Defense encouraged the use of psychological interrogation tactics, in addition to physical abuse. Intelligence also toyed with detainees' health through the use of mefloquine, an anti-malarial medication, at doses known to induce anxiety, paranoia, and other mental harm. The FBI reported numerous interrogation techniques exploiting psychological weaknesses and preying on the detainees' Muslim faith. Gitmo existed as a place where, quote, intel could push nearly all the boundaries of torture without fear of liability. It placed the intelligence mission at the forefront, demoting any interests of the detention mission. In doing so, the laboratory was formed, paving the way for a multitude of psychological experiments against detainees who were admittedly not, quote, the worst of the worst, but were in fact merely low-level enemy combatants. Gitmo operated as a battle lab, a world where the experimentation on the defenseless served to generate data with which to counsel and train interrogators at military facilities across the earth. These bases utilized the insight granted by intelligence officers from Gitmo, most notably Bagram and Abu Ghraib. With Gitmo serving as the command center for worldwide interrogation coordination, the laboratory could utilize the results of the torture testing in training future interrogators in different theaters of war. After multiple Senate investigations and the declassification of many documents, the world can now see that Gitmo was no simple POW detention center, but was instead operated as America's battle laboratory. So now we know that Gitmo was run to torture individuals, to find out human limitations to torture. It was made to report directly to the President through daily personal briefings with the Secretary of Defense. Why were these two parties, Bush and Rumsfeld, directly interested in the torture going on in Guantanamo, since it was obviously not for national security interests? Could there be a satanic connection? Could this prison also be for the harvesting of low-level energetic vibrations? Keep in mind, Skull and Bones is definitely connected.